let's uh, let's talk about probing. So, it's not. What did you guys think of the reading? Let's see. What was I picked a couple papers you guys to read. There's what's really nice is there's like probing is a probing has been a good way of looking inside networks. Because it's simple, but it follows machine learning principles. So a lot of people believe in it. It's simple enough that a lot of people can do it. Um, so let me just introduce like what the heck people mean by probing. It's pretty simple, right? You're asking this question. Without the censorship here, this little black square. Here you go. Right? You're asking this question, right? Does my neural network representation, do my neurons know some concept? Right? Does it know some concept? But this is a weird question, right? Like when you started this class, if I said, hey, your mission was to figure out if my neural network knows concept C. Does it know the difference between right and wrong? Right? Does it know something like that? You'd be like, how do you even quantify that? And so probing gives you a really simple exercise, it's a formula for quantifying it. And so today we'll just talk about, what that formula is, some of the limitations, some of the other things people have done. I think you guys had a lot of good questions about the reading that will cover most of this stuff. And so the formula goes like this. So basically, you have to decide what your concept is. Like, what's the difference between right or wrong, right? Well, how do you do that? You do the machine learning thing. You define some data set, like a labeled data set of like, I've got some x's which are right, and then other x's that are wrong. So the example from the TCAP figure 1 was I've got some images which are all stripy, and then I've got other images which are just regular, images, and that's the difference, right? These are stripes, these are regular images, and I tell the difference between these two things. I wonder if the network has an internal concept which would like know the difference between these two things. So that's what it means to define a concept. So you could see, oh, actually, maybe the concept is like this is like not as stripy as that or something like that, even though there's some stripes on it, things like that. You put your definition of where the line is between positive examples and negative examples of your concept are just given by a data set, right? And if you want to define your concept a different way, you just form your data set a different way. Makes sense? So that's the first step. Second step is this: is you have to decide where in your network you care about what it knows. So I've just written down there's some layer of the network Z, which is where you care about it, and then you just ask the question, can we extract a classifier for my concept out of that Z? So if the Z comes out of f of x, the first bunch of layers of my neural network, then I just train a classifier G to try to predict my concept out of that layer of the network, right? And so that's just classic machine learning. There's a lot of ways of training a classifier, and you can use any of them. But like the simplest way is to just train a linear model, like basically learn a vector that if you dot product it with the neurons, then that weighted sum gives you a score that tells you which side of the line you're on. That makes sense? And then, if the data set's big enough, the line's never going to be perfect, right? It'll have some level of accuracy. That makes sense? So that's step 2, is you just like train this classifier. Now it could be a complicated classifier. It could be a nonlinear classifier or something like that. And so it's not a separating plane anymore now. It's like some weird boundary that you're learning. But you can learn any kind of classifier. And so there's some debate about this second step, like what you should do. And a lot of papers have been written about the second step because there's the machine learning part in there. It's on machine learning venues. So they like to debate about how to do the machine learning. And then And then the third step is after you get your classifier, then you measure its accuracy. And the idea of the probing is that if you can extract your concept more accurately, then you take that as evidence that the information is in there. And if you have trouble extracting your concept, then that's evidence that the information's not in there. Or at least if it's in there, it's hard to get out. That makes sense? Yeah. So that's it. That's the formula for probing. So this so now all your projects are sort of the form. I wonder if my neural network has a certain thought, or if I wonder if my neural network knows a certain thing. And I think that in 2019, you could write those papers. And the classic thing would be you learn how to train a classifier, you do these 3 steps, and you'd be done with your paper. You write the thing. That makes sense? And actually, but because of that, it's not a bad step to do this anyway, right? But I want to also, sort of give you guys room to ask, to sort of question this, and we'll explore the area of probing a little bit more. So, okay, so let's take a moment. Okay, Jasmine, kick us off. You had some questions.
I guess I'm really confused by the Hewitt Young paper where they're like you can have problems where like your probe looks like it's doing really good, but the representation like still isn't there.
Right.
At the same time though, like if it performs well, like there's like some kind of signal there. So to me it's like why are we doing all this? Like what is interpretability?
What's it about? What do we
like at what point do we have like a concept that we like know?
Yes. What's the hope and what's the challenge here? So I think the hope is to get our hands on this question, right? It's sort of the lie detector question. What did Nixon know, and when did he know it? Right, sort of the question, and so we're asking this of our neural networks. What did they know? When did they know it? Right. So that's the hope, but then it turns out that it's kind of this mushy thing, right? So, and I think that the Hewitt thing, part of the Hewitt thing comes down to this question of, you know, if you know something that is closely related to what you're being asked about, does that mean you know the thing? Like if I knew, I probe your brain and I know that you're thinking that it's like a square root and it's a square root of 2. And then I say, yes, so you know that it's 1.4 or something, right? Well, I don't know if you know that it's 1.4 something. Maybe you know that it's like the square root of 2, but maybe you don't know what the square root of 2 is, right? But then maybe somebody with a certain level of expectations about common sense might go to you and say, well, you knew it was a square root of 2, so you knew it was 1.4, right? Like anybody would know. But then you might say, no, well, I didn't know, right? I didn't know, but the square root of 2 is 1.4. Like, is that? They say, how can you not know? That's so obvious. It's just a definition of what it is, right? So that you can have a difference of opinion of what this is. And so when you train a classifier to look at a thing and like solve a problem, is this really a view that the network knows something? Or is this a view that the classifier could figure out the answer to the question, right? It's like, like I can look at what information you had, it's a square root of 2, and I could figure out it's 1.4. Like I'm like the classifier here, I can figure out what's going on, but maybe you couldn't have, right? So there's this weird piece of epistemology here of like, what does it mean to actually know something? But I think that, just asking generally what the goal of it is maybe we have some sense of what it means to know something, and we're trying to get our hands on it. And probing is one approach to it. I think that some of the Hewitt things are related to this dilemma that I'm describing about what's obvious, what's not obvious. We'll talk about Hewitt a little bit more. Let's ask, what is Kai's question? I see her. Who's Kai? Oh, Kai, yes.
It's kind of the same thing. Like most of the concepts from the concept activation paper are like pretty concrete, stripes or beagles.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, like, how do we know if it's actually capturing something?
A concept like beautiful.
Yeah, like to be.
Yeah. Yeah. How about a concept like sycophantic? Right. So I really like that. So these minimal pairs that your classmates just presented here for sycophancy is like an example of constructing one of these data sets. It's like, oh, there's like sycophancy over here. There's not sycophancy over here. I wonder if my neural network keeps track of the difference between them. You see this scatter plot with everything mixed up. It doesn't look like this, right? You think, I don't know. Maybe it's not keeping track, right? Look at Grace. Grace is like, I don't know. It doesn't look like this, right? Maybe my network's not thinking that way, right? So, but I think that so you can ask this. So that's the beauty of this general formulation. You can ask this question about anything. It could be beauty. It could be in some abstract thing. Just whatever you have in your mind, and you can just like define the classification set, and then you can ask a question. That it doesn't guarantee you that you're gonna get a positive answer. You might get really low accuracy at the end of your probe, or maybe not. Okay, so that's sort of that. And Claire, yeah. So what was your question?
I was like, the probes are only using human-like features, but sometimes models split things into like
non-human-like things.
Non-human-like things.
Yeah, I really like this question. I think that so, a lot of the methods, most of the methods we're studying in the class, start off with a hypothesis. Like, you want to know if the AI knows something, and to ask that, you have to define this data set. You have to decide what's so what if the thing that the neural network knows is something that you can't distinguish? Like you can't tell the difference. Then how the heck do you make this probe data set in the first place, right? So it's a limitation of this method. I think that that's one of the things. So I think it's a good question. There are probably other reasons. There's probably other ways of like chasing after something that a network knows that you might not be able to suss out, but probing is not the way to get it. And Isaac.
Yeah, this is just like I think, inversion of all the questions that have been asked. But it struck me that like they had like the example of like images of CEOs, but like what makes them images of CEOs, or just that we're calling them images of CEOs.
Yes.
Like it seemed like a lot was writing on how we are kind of imputing our own concepts into the images as opposed to necessarily kind of coming out of the model itself or corresponding to something in the images of the model is responding to.
Yeah, so I think it's right. It's basically the same kind of question. And so the things that equips us to answer is trying to find a correspondence between the way that we think about the world and maybe the way that the network is representing the world. So that's right. And so if it's something very inhuman that we're trying to suss out, then it's hard to do this for it. Now there are some techniques. So for example, there are people who ask this question about inhuman things by doing things like taking two neural networks and seeing if they agree. Right? Like you can just take one neural network and take a random neuron or something and say, well, I don't know what this neuron does. It might be something imperceptible. But I wonder if this second neural network learns the same neuron, right? If it has the same information. So you can use the first neural network's neuron to create this data set. And then you can use the second neural network to see if you can probe that concept back out. And so people have done that to try to get a handle on things that are not human interpretable. And there's various fancy ways of doing this larger scale that even neuroscientists do to try to align brains of people with each other and things like that. So if anybody's interested in doing that kind of thing for their project, then let me know. We'll add a segment to the class to talk about these kind of methods. Yes.
Is the goal to probe for concepts that exist in multiple different types of models? Is that like
when you do this kind of thing? Yes. So I think that there's this sort of holy grail of the project of the project of interpretability for AI, which is, can I get a printout of everything that the AI knows, including stuff that I didn't know to ask, right? And so, well, certainly you can. You can just print out all the numbers of all the neurons, but that doesn't tell you anything. So, like, what are the meaningful concepts? Can I get a printout of all the meaningful concepts? It does. What does that even mean? And so, one way of chasing that problem is you take 100 neural networks. There's like trained slightly differently, slightly different architecture, something like this, and you use techniques kind of like what I'm describing, like see if they have the same neurons as each other or something like that. And then you'll see that, oh, there's only a certain number of neurons that they all have, right? Most of the neurons, they like have, they're very different, but they have a few neurons, which they all learn regardless. And so there was a nice paper, you can look it up, it's called Rosetta Neurons, where they do this. And the name of it, suggests the research program, right? They're like, if all these neural networks have these neurons in common, then these are sort of like the key, translation points. It's like a Rosetta Stone for us to be able to translate between concepts. Maybe it's like the key for even decoding the whole idea of the internal language of neural networks to begin with. So that's the technique that people use. Makes sense? And so, right. And so some of these things are, right. Some of these things are really nice dreams. I think that they're mostly speculative right now. Like, I don't think anybody's really figured out the formula for dumping everything that a neural network knows. So, okay. So, Amrita had this question. Amrita, yes.
How expressed with it?
Yes. What the heck about LLMs? Why assign you like an image paper? This TCAF thing. Well, partly is I just wanted to give you a little historical context. And probing is pretty old. Probing goes back before the TCAF paper, but yeah, as early as the TCAF paper, people were already thinking about how to understand what neural networks knew, and they were using probing methods. And so around the same time, people were looking at machine translation systems and using probing to figure out what's going on. So let me just describe like the whole machine translation setup. It's like a classic way that people use probing. So you can kind of see how it works in practice and other people research papers, right? And so here they had some machine translation system. I'm not going to get into RNNs and everything. They're kind of like transformers, but different, right? But they also have little layers where you have a representation of a token, and then you can ask the question, what does the network know about this token? Does it know that it's a pronoun? Does it know it's plural? Does it know it's a verb or noun? Right. So it's kind of this can actually be kind of interesting questions, because if you have like the word play, right, it could mean a verb, it could mean a noun, and then within the concept of a verb or noun, it could mean different things within that. And so you can ask it, hey, is play a verb or a noun? Classify that for me from looking at the neural representation here. And if you can get good accuracy on a probe like that, then it suggests that maybe your network knows the difference between a verb and a noun. And maybe it doesn't. And so this is the kind of thing that they would do. And they would ask simpler questions like, is this plural? Is this singular? Is this present tense? Is it past tense? These linguists, they have all sorts of things that they like to measure. And so here's like an example of a set of questions about plural and past tense and uppercase. They call these morphological attributes of a word. And what they did is they went to machine translation system and they went to all the layers, the early layers and the late layers, not that different from a transformer. And they asked, what was the accuracy of the probe classifier when translating from Czech to English or Spanish to English, whatever, right? And you can see that at the early layers, it's pretty accurate. You can tell the difference between these morphological things. It can classify plural versus non-plural. pretty well at the early layers. But the weird thing is that as you went deeper in the network, these are only 4-layer networks, but as you went deeper in the network, the accuracy dropped. What the heck do you think is going on? So do you see that? So don't worry about the last bar. The last bar is aggregate. If you train a probe over all four layers at once, which you can do also, then it's like super accurate, right? So, but if you train it on just one layer at once, the accuracy is dropping. What do you think that means? What do you think that means? Why would the accuracy drop the more computation you did?
Like getting the concept and forgetting.
It's good.
When you tell someone, "Oh, I read somewhere," and you forgot where you read it, or even what language you read it in.
Yeah.
I don't remember that.
Yeah. So it looks like forgetting here, right? So this is a funny picture of like forgetting. It's like when it first read the text, it knew this was past tense, right? And then as it goes further into its layers, then it kind of like the story is like lower probe accuracy, right? It's like it kind of is forgetting that it's past tense. Isn't that weird? Yeah. Strange, right?
Then with the Hewitt thing that they suggest the memorizing proof.
Yes, we'll get to that.
Yes.
Yes.
I don't skip to the end.
No, it's okay. No, it's okay. But yes, in the Hewitt thing, right? So the question is this even meaningful to ask? Are we looking at the right thing? So like the classic probe thing is to look at accuracy, and Hewitt is like, it's not about accuracy. Why is everybody looking at accuracy? Right? We should look at selectivity or something. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Yes.
But in that example, because it's a function of the word identity, you would expect earlier layers to have higher accuracy for memorization.
Because that's right. So because at the earlier layers, you were just told the word just now. Like the information hasn't been messed up, and so it's obvious.
Yeah. So I guess that's yeah.
I don't know, right? It's kind of like do you buy Hewitt or not? Like, do you really want to look at selectivity or not? If you drew this graph and you showed selectivity instead of accuracy, would it give you an insight? That's a pretty simple question. But you do see these accuracies drop, and then the story that people tell. But you can think about it now that you read all these papers, right? The story that people tell is that when the accuracy drops, it sort of suggests that the network is forgetting something. It's like erasing that information. It used to have all this information about whether the word was plural or not, and it went into the deeper layers and it sort of erased the information. So let me show you a contrasting experiment. Same set of people. Now here, they're looking at syntactic relations. So I'm not really a linguist, but I gather this is if you have like a dependent clause or something like that, you can have different sentences where the same word might sometimes be the object of the sentence, might be the subject of the sentence, might be dependent on the word, or might stand alone, right? And so you can make a syntax tree, and you can say what are the relations for a word, and then you can ask a probing question about this. You can say, can I tell the difference between words that have a syntactic relation and words that don't, or words that have a different syntactic relation? And so the accuracies for this task look kind of like this. It depends on the language. I don't know what's going on with French to English, but like for Spanish to English, like the probe accuracy goes up as you go through the layers. Right? Why would that be? Why would some of the things like go down and other things go up? Interesting. So this contrast between things going down and things going up was enough. It was like compelling enough that people wrote a lot of papers about this, and the intuition was that some of these things it takes a lot of context processing to figure out what's going on here with syntactic relations. And if you want to do a good job at machine translation, you need to know this pretty well. So more and more of the neural network's representation is being used to represent stuff like this. So that's why when you probe it at the later layers, then the accuracy goes up. It suggests that it's doing a better job at representing this information. It's got like this information represented more accurately. get to that. And at least that's the story. That makes sense? But it's cool though, right? I think that these experiments are genuinely cool. This idea that you might be forgetting something that you were just told to input in order to make room for something that you're figuring out that wasn't obvious for them. And I think that people generally still like believe this story. And if you find a sequence of communications in your neural network that you want to characterize, doing a probe like this and contrasting between probes that are less accurate and more accurate is definitely a worthwhile thing to try and to report. And people have been looking at probe accuracies for decades, so they'll be able to read what you have. They'll know what all the caveats are. They'll be able to read that experiment. Make sense? Okay, so for example, my student Sheridan last year wrote a paper, which was this type of probe. So actually, there was a question here. Did I skip any questions? I'm going to skip questions. I've noted question plans to stop and ask you guys for any questions. So I think that one of the questions was like, hey, so what about multi-valued attributes where it might not be yes or no, but it might be like 5 different things or 10 different things that so yeah, you can make probes that are multi-weight classifiers, no problem. And so the classic one is logit lens, right? The logit lens is a probe, is a non-trained probe. It's a probe that is just like the pre-trained decoder layer, and it's a classifier. It's a 50,000 weight classifier that tells you which token is the most likely one at any given spot. And so what Sheridan did was, instead of using logit lens, Sheridan trained a probe, a 50,000 weight probe, on predicting the most likely word in a very mechanical way. And so here's the setup. You have like the intermittent as like a piece of Wikipedia text, and Sheridan takes like the token mit. And so the token mit comes in, it just represents the token mit. It's just like the embedding for mit at the first layer, and as it goes through all the layers, then that vector is evolved into something that eventually like predicts the next token, right? But instead of like saying how accurate it is at predicting the next token, which is what logit lens does, Sheridan asked, how good is it at predicting mit itself, right? So like you inputted mit, and if you go like 5 layers down and you asked, oh, out of the 50,000 tokens, which one was the original token that you started with? Do you still remember that you were mit? That makes sense? And so you can use that as a probing question. And you might think, oh, that's easy. It's like 100%. No, but it's not, because you see the same erasure phenomenon going on. Like the accuracy drops. And so here's mit. Starts off at 1.0. Of course, you can read the embedding right out of the network. But as you go to, in 10 layers, right, it kind of forgets a little bit. It's down here. That didn't forget a lot. It's at like at 80%. It drops down to 70% or something, right? So it's erasing this information is sort of the story, right? Now there's other information that's interesting, like how about the previous word? If you go to mit and you ask what's your representation, how much does it know it comes after inter? Right, intermittent, right? Like, does mit know that comes after inter? That seems like it's a pretty important word. It's like it's not about mittens here. It's about intermittence, right? It's pretty different. So to understand really what mit means, it might be handy to know that you come after inter. So that's like another probe. It's a very mechanical probe, and then you can ask this classifier question. And at the beginning, mit is very bad at predicting the inter comes before, because there's been no attention heads applied to it. So the probe is like at almost 0 accuracy. Now it's not at 0 accuracy. 0 would be all the way down here. It's like a little higher than it. Why would it be a little higher than 0? Even if you haven't written you haven't run any attention heads yet, and you have mit, and you're like, oh, you know what? 10% of the time I can guess what the token was right before me. Anyway, without even seeing it, you're totally blinded. You don't even have attention heads. Why is the accuracy not down at closer to 0? Why is that?
The previous words also include information on the future words. So like
Even easier than that. even easier. It's almost like if imagine you were a cryptographer and you just had like the middle of the word given to you without any context, you might be able to guess what the part of the word was before, right? That makes sense? Just because of bigram words, just bigram words, it's just because you know that you're in English, and there are certain things that are in English that just tend to happen before, even without any additional information. So the baseline accuracy of the classifier is sort of the accuracy of bigram statistics in English without any other contextual knowledge. But then, as soon as you start running attention heads, then you do have contextual knowledge, and the accuracy goes up to 70%. And so the information about the previous token is being fed in, goes up, right? And then it pays attention to it for a little while, and then it starts erasing that too. Kind of interesting, right? That makes sense? And then you can ask about, oh, how about 2 tokens before, like V, right? Oh, it actually pays attention to that too. And it puts a little bit of that information in there, and then it erases it over time, right? And then 4 tokens before it has this a little bit less, right? And then what's this yellow line? The yellow line is interesting. It goes like, this yellow line is different. You see what that yellow line is? This yellow line is about not looking back, but looking forward, looking at the next token, right? So can it predict the next token from the representation? Why is it going up? Why is it getting more and more accurate at predicting the next token as you go through more and more layers? Why would that be? Okay, some machine learning person, tell me why would it be?
Language.
Because it's a language model.
Yes.
Why do you say it's because of the language model?
That is what it is.
What does the TA say?
I mean, that's what it is trained on.
That's what it's trained to do, right? So basically, just from lecture 1, right? There's a language model, so it's trained to predict the next word, right? And so as you go through more and more letters, it's like has more information about like its good guess for the next word until it gets here. So this is about how good this language model is. Like 40% of the time, it can guess the next word in Wikipedia correctly given the context. So that's pretty nice. Right, so it's like, oh, this is good. So it's like working, right? The language model is working. But then at the same time as predicting the next word, it's also keeping track of all these other things from like previous words. And you can see this interesting profile of the information. So that's basically, I just wanted to share this how probing works. Now, okay, so the weird thing, the reason that Sheridan wrote a paper and why you could write, so you could write this, you could like, somebody would have written this in 2017 and it would have been a paper by itself, this graph. But in 2024, you can't write that paper anymore. Everybody knows this, right? So the reason that it's a paper in 2024 is because of this contrast with this other plot, which is the same lines, but which is this observation that at certain tokens, the plot looks different. So if you take a look at the word ent or the token ent, and you do the same plots instead of the token mit, then the accuracies look like this. So what mit really is a stand-in for any generic token in Wikipedia, right? But what ent is not any generic token in Wikipedia. These are what Sheridan calls the last token of a multi-token word. So some words are tokenized in ways that they have to be split up into multiple tokens. And if you have a word that got split up, and you take a look at the last word, and you do this probing, then you get this other thing. And what Sheridan says is, she says, it means that like that word erases knowledge of what it was. Like so, like ent, does ent know that it's ent? Well, obviously, right as soon as it comes in, it knows. But as soon as you start exposing it to attention heads, what the heck is the model doing? The model's like you may have been ent, but I'd rather not know that you were ent. I need you to forget this. Like the model's like quickly erasing this. And it's also quickly erasing all the other contextual information. It's crazy. I don't know, like what? So basically Sheridan wrote this paper saying, what the heck is this erasure? There's this token erasure going on, right? Why is it forgetting stuff so quickly? Yes.
I have two questions.
Yes.
The first one, like the fact that ent is a common like ending word in
Yeah.
English, like that's persistent. So did you all try like changing the prefix and keeping the last token constant and seeing if the model's erasure is consistent?
Yeah, that's basically what the experiment is. So basically, this is based on a huge scrape of Wikipedia, and so ent I'm sure shows up at the end of a bunch of different words. Probably all these tokens show up at the end of a bunch of different words, and so this is an average accuracy over all of that mix, and yeah, so and pretty consistently, ent. If you ask the representation of ent, do you know what came before you? Then it does peak over here at layer 3. It does sort of know what came before. But then pretty quickly when you get to layer 10 or something, it's basically forgotten it. Unlike the normal case, when at layer 10, it still remembers what came before. Make sense? Does that answer the question? Or
Yeah.
Okay.
How did like they develop the intuition that we should look at the
So look at this.
yeah, like versus like look at the space after intermittent. Like how did the
Yeah.
graph one to lead to graph two?
Yeah, why look at this? Yeah, it's from the kind of digging that we're asking you guys to do. It's like, what was it that? So basically, the real story for this piece of research was that I had told Sheridan, look for the opposite of this. Like if you have a multi-token word, then the process of concept formation in this environment where the words split up into lots of tokens, it should require you to have a better awareness of the tokens that came before if you're a meaningful word. So if you're a word like intermittent, then you should not have the luxury of forgetting what came before you. Like if you were the word the, then yeah, who cares what came before you? You don't need to know that because you know the means the. But if you're intermittent and you're ent, you need to know what came before you. So you would have a really accurate view of this. So Sheridan's like, okay, probing, I can do probing. We'll set up this probing thing. And Sheridan showed up a week later and says, I don't know, it's my first week in the PhD and my experiment's like coming out wrong, right? It's like this. It's like the information is not there. I must have set it up wrong, right? And so Sheridan basically spent, a couple months digging through the probing code and through different data sets and different ways of setting this up until we were finally convinced that, actually, Sheridan is a brilliant experimentalist, had set it up right on the day one, and had found this surprise that was exactly the opposite of what we had expected. That makes sense? And so that's where this came from. Right. And then the question is, okay, if it's counter to what you would expect, why is it doing this? What the heck? Right? And it leads to some other papers. Right? Okay. So yeah. So Isaac, what was your question?
I was wondering about the relationship between this and hatching. And
Yeah.
like the class notes suggested that they're complementary.
Yeah.
Is it complementary in the sense of like, if given an option, we should always do patching, and given resource constraints, this is a viable second best alternative, or is there like something more complex about the relation? How we should think about the relationship?
It's a little bit more complex. I'd say that I think they really are complementary. So is the second best. So I think that because probing is older than the practice of patching, I often go around telling people, no, patching's better. You need to do causal experiments because this is just a correlative experiment. You get fooled in all these ways that we'll talk about. And then I think that you guys already have intuition about that. From the questions, you guys understand how probing can be fooled. But I think that probing is maybe half the story. I think that if you can sometimes get a similar picture about information content from patching, but it's different. Your packaging is telling you if the model is using some signal. It's not telling you if the signal is present, if it's not used, and sometimes you are interested in whether the signal is present, even if in this particular piece of text it's not used. Like maybe in some other piece of text it might be used or something like that, and you just want to know if the model is like prepared to have that information available. Just so that this experiment is kind of like this. It's like, I don't know what might come after this. I don't know if the model needs to know this information, but it's just interesting to know that regardless of whether the model is using that information later, it's just not even there, right? Even like a trained probe can't get it out, right? And so if a trained probe can't get it out, then the model probably won't be able to get it out. And so, so it's complementary. I would recommend for any of these papers, like make a tripod, like try to find more than one way of characterizing the representation of the eclat, and probing is a powerful tool, and it should be in your arsenal. Okay. That sort of answer the question? Yeah, these things are always in flux. You had a question.
Yeah, so my question is, so it has a constant vector. Does the prediction use that vector to do some prediction, or it's just correlated with the concept?
And I think I answered that just now, right? It's like it doesn't necessarily use it, right?
Yeah.
So the probe is using it, right? But we don't know if the model itself is going to use that information downstream. Right? And I think that's the fundamental problem with probes, is that just because information is there doesn't mean it's actually doing it or doing the thing that you imagine. So, this is a classic thing. So so the classic approach, and people are very interested in this question of, does my model have an inherent political belief? Maybe it's biased. Maybe my model is biased against professors. I don't like these models that are so biased against professors, right? And so, so what I can do is I can look to see if I write a sentence about professors or something like that, or I write a sentence about me, and I wonder if it's keeping track of the fact that I'm a professor, right? So I'll take a bunch of text that I've written and a bunch of text that non-professors have written, and I'll ask, if I probe that text, can the model tell the difference between whether I'm a professor or whether I'm not a professor, just from my email or something? Like that would be like evidence that it's biased against professors, right? Because it knows, it's keeping track of the fact that it's different, right? And I could train up one of these probes. And what if I got this hit? What if I found out the probe is super accurate? If you go to layer 15 on the last token of my email, I can classify the difference between professor and non-professor email at like 99.9% accuracy. It's like shouting red. It's like completely there, the information of whether it's professor or not, right? Does that mean that the model is like thinking about, is this person a professor? I'm going to be biased against them or something? It's not necessarily, right? And the information might be there, but it might be that the model doesn't actually use the information for anything. And so, and it might be a spurious correlate. I mean, it might be that it's paying attention to all of it. So, what is it like that I'm probing out? It's like maybe the probe recognized that, the model cares if I'm writing things about having lots of fundraising meetings and other boring professor stuff or whatever, right? Just like all sorts of stuff, right? And it's just keeping track of all sorts of other things. And it just happens to be that I can aggregate all those signals and get like a 99% accuracy on like, am I a professor or not? Is that a concept inside the model, or is that just an aggregate classification result that you can get if you probe a thing? So that's the answer to the question. The answer is no. Right. Okay. So, and then Ananya had a different way of asking the question.
Yeah, but I think you answered it.
No, I like your question better. What was your question?
I don't remember, but I remember thinking.
Oh, too late. Okay, then you don't get the answer. Okay, well, no. So you asked it a slightly different way. What did you say?
Yeah, I guess that, like, I know this is what the paper spoke about for like correlational probes.
Yes.
Kind of also asked but which is like understanding whether like the information exists. But then,
right.
Like again, causal probe, I would imagine is like how does it use?
What would a causal probe be?
Yeah.
Yes, and I forgot. I was going to stick in another slide for what a causal probe is, and I didn't have time to come back to add this slide for you. So, but I'll point you to a couple papers. So you can probe a model to see if you can get a classifier out to do things, but you can also train an intervention on a model that asks, what is the optimal intervention that I can do that optimizes for some causal effect? And it's sort of a dual for a probe. It's sort of a causal probe. And there's been a couple papers written that suggest this kind of thing. So the two that I would suggest is there's a paper called amnesic probing. Like amnesia, if we got something. So maybe Nikhil can remember amnesic probing. We'll put that link in the Discord for people, if people are interested in trying that technique on their thing for causal probe. And then the other thing that people do is they do something called a distributed alignment search, where instead, so like in a probe, you're looking for what subspace, like what vector you can dot product by something to give you the most accurate classifier. But you can also do an intervention search. You can say what vector or what subspace is there where if I were to perturb things in the direction of that subspace, it would maximize certain causal effects. And so that general scheme, people figure out how to operationalize that, and they call it distributed alignments. So that's another thing to sort of. They're not as well established as probes, as people who are advocating for these things. I think the jury's still out on them, but if you're into it, give it a try. Okay. Okay, so the TCAP paper and spurious features. Okay, Rice, what was the question about spurious features? I don't remember. What was your question?
I think I was asking about, I think you touched upon like the questions just a little bit, where I was just asking like when features like coexist and like they have correlation with each other, and when you have like relational probes rather than causal probes, would you learn something else that make your prediction on this particular feature accurate, but like you're actually learning something else?
Right. And what does it look like? So I'll come back to that in a second. Actually, I'm going to answer Armina's question a little bit more at first, because I did have this slide. I'm remembering now why I put these things. Okay, so right? And so the question. So for a causal probe, actually the paper that you read, TCAV, is a little bit causal. So because it has two steps. First, it gets this probe direction, right? By just doing regular linear, classification training. But then once you have this classifier, they don't just recommend just reporting the accuracy, which is that's a standard thing to do with probes, is you just train this thing, and then you take a holdout set that you didn't train on, and then you just report accuracy on that thing. And then that tells you like how much this information is present. That's the normal formula. But what they do in TCAP is they say, no, actually, what you're really interested in is how much, like the concept of stripiness, it might be present, but we want to know how much it's used in the classification of zebras, right? And so what they do is they say, if you took this gradient, if you take like perturbations of the representation, how much does it change the prediction of zebra? Right, so that's basically what this gradient is. Basically, we've got the predictions of zebra, and we're asking, what is the gradient? What is the derivative of the prediction of zebra with respect to vector changes in the representation? So that gives you like, how much the changes in representation change zebra, and then you dot product it with this stripy direction that you got from the probe. And so what this is really telling you is, if we made a perturbation, if things were a little bit more stripy, right? If you made a perturbation like this concept of a stripe, then how much would that proportionally change your score for zebra? Would it push it up? Would it push it up a little? Would it push it up a lot? And so whatever this number is, that's like the TCAP score of like how much stripes are thought of as causing zebras. That makes sense? So because that's like maybe I want to know if like being a professor leads to bias against me. So I have a different sentence that says, do you like this person or not? Yes or no, right? And I'm looking for no, like the model doesn't like this person, and then I put this professor email before it, and I like train a classifier on all the professor emails and stuff like that. And then now what I want to know is not just like, is the probe accurate, like can it tell if it's a professor or not, but then I also want to see if I bump it in that direction to make it think it's a professor, how much is it saying, adjusting the prediction, no, right? How much is it making me say, no, I don't like this person? So then I would say, yes, the model has this class of things that it doesn't like, and one of the major signals it uses in that class is whether you're a professor or not. Your professor really doesn't like you, and I can compare it to other things. Like if you like ice cream, it does like you, stuff like that. That makes sense. So this is what the TCAV proposal is. TCAV is, a well-read paper. It's not a bad technique to try if you want to try to attach some causality, but also for more modern takes, because TCAV is old, we might look at the other papers that I mentioned. But this is one way of getting causality out. Yes. Now Bryce has a question. Right. So this right. Yes.
Sorry, I was following up on what you said.
Yes.
I was just wondering how effective are like gradient-based interpretations on LLMs?
Right. Right.
Like, for example, I suspect like a lot of tokens might have like non-zero gradients.
Yes.
When it comes to like noise.
Yes. Yes. I think that it may be controversial. Well, I think after spring break, I'm going to see if I can get Gabriel to come talk about salience methods, which are very, very gradient based. And I think he's a believer that they have a lot of value on LLMs. And so I'll let him give you the optimistic point of view. I think that the pessimistic point of view is that these systems are trained on this very discrete data. So maybe a little different from image classifiers where images are kind of continuous data. But in really discrete data, it's not as clear that the gradient is as informative as it is in images. On the other hand, what else do we have, right? So the other thing that we have is we could do a non-minuscule perturbation. We can actually change something in the direction, really, really substitute in a thing, which is what patching is. And so that's why I mostly recommend people do patching. That makes sense. It's the equivalent. Okay, or steering is the equivalent of this, but in macroscopic terms. So now the other Red's question was about spurious features. So I wanted to tell you a story. How much time do we have? 15 minutes. Okay, so story time. This is about a paper I'm very proud to have helped out on, and a mistake that we made in the paper. So a research mistake. I'll fess up to here on video. Okay. So this is kind of today's paper, and it's about emergent world representations. And the idea is it's about concepts. It's about does a model have a concept inside? And here's the basic setup. The setup is, let's say you were playing Othello, and with your friend, and every day you play Othello, but your friend is very loud and formal about Othello. So every time, what your friend says is, he says, when we play, I want you to shout out the move that you make. Right? I'm going in C4. Okay, I'm going B3. Okay, C6. So you just shout these moves out really quickly, and then you play the whole game. And then one day, you're playing, and then there's this odd sound. You hear this bird going like C6, 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 right? And outside there's this crow that's learned how to imitate your games. And oddly enough, right, when you look at the crow, right, it's you say D3, and the crow is thinking, C5, B6, E3, right? It's like what actually when you go and you listen to the crow, and you realize it's actually emitting valid games. And after you say a bunch of games to it, right? The odd thing is it will always tell you another valid Othello move after you've done this. So if you had come across a strange crow that could utter valid Othello moves on every word that it said, it would lead you to this question. does the crow know what Othello is? Right? It's just like, listen to these words. Does it have, like, what you call it is you call it a world model, right? Not just like a single binary concept, but like, does the crow have like a complete coherent idea of what Othello is? Does the crow like know in its head like what the game board is? And certainly, if you like went outside and looked at the crow, and it was standing there on top of an Othello board, and it was like pushing little seeds around, then you'd be like, oh yeah, it knows, it knows. But if it was just saying it, then like, how do you know whether the crow knows what Othello is? So one way of knowing is to use probes, right? And here's how the probing would work. And this is what we did in our paper, right? We went to the crow, which obviously is a 8-layer autoaggressive transformer. Okay? and then went to the crow, and we went into its brain, went to each layer, and we said, at this layer, I wonder if it knows whether this square here is occupied by black stone or white stone in Othello, right? And there are 64 squares, and so there's 64 probes. Like, I wonder if we can get like high accuracy probes for all 64 squares. So this collection of 64 probes is like a world model of Othello. And if you can get high accuracy in all of them, then definitely this model has like not only information about Othello, but like the whole board mapped out. That makes sense? Is that cool? So that's like another example of like what you might look for. Like the mapping people might look for things like this, right? It's just like this, right? And I'll tell you, this is what we found. We trained a whole bunch of probes, and here's like the 64 probes, and you get the little vectors for the probe, and they're arranged in this cool geometries all over the place. But the cool thing about the geometry is not just the geometry. It's like these probes are like 91% accurate, 98% accurate. They're pretty good, right? If you train the probes. But we train the probes two different ways. When we trained the probes, we trained nonlinear probes, we could get 98% accuracy, which tells the story that we wanted to tell. We wanted to tell the story. These transformers have a world model, right? It's like looking inside the crow and you see a little Othello board in there. It's amazing, right? But the sad reality is that when we actually did this experiment, I kept on hounding Kenna to train linear probes and get linear probes to work. And the highest accuracy he could squeeze out was like 79%, which is like rounding up. Yeah, I think that like he's probably more at 75%, right? And so, but like the most he can get out of linear probes is 79%. So like 20% of the time, 25% of the time, they're wrong, right? Which is not that convincing for such a simple problem where it's just classifier between white and black, right? It's like it's just only like a bit better than random, right? You want to be in the 90%. And so he had to write this text in the so we did this. We made an MLP instead. So what's wrong with a multi-layer perceptron? Who doesn't like multi-layer probes? Who? You don't like multi-layer probes. Who that you read doesn't like multi-layer probes? I'll give you a hint. We already read Bean Kim's paper. We talked about that. So who was the other paper? Hewitt. Okay, Hewitt doesn't like multi-layer probes. And I'll tell you why in a minute, but I'll tell you why through this story first. Right? Okay, so this is like in the appendix or something. Here's like the error rate for Othello on linear probes. It's sitting in the 25% range. Like it's pretty bad, right, for such a simple problem, right? Yes.
We have 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, so the upshot is after we published this paper, like a month later, Neil Nanda posts his blog post. And it says, actually, there's a linear probe that works. And he says, if you use a linear probe, here are the accuracies you get. And where white is like 0, right? Or like, near 0. And blue is like 50%. It's like near the edge, you can get some percentage. The reason that we're up to 25% is because, maybe at the edge we're better at guessing, but like in the middle, it's like 0. Like you can't get any accuracy. Or 50%. Right? So it's like random, right? But then he says, hey, but look, if I take this classifier and I don't train it on whether it's white or black on every move. But if I train it whether it's white or black on every other move, here's accuracy, like 100%, right? Every other move. And if I train the classifier, but I flip its parity, so it's not answering whether it's white or black, but it's answering whether that square is occupied by the person to move or the person to play, or a person opposite, right? That is also 100%. So we had trained the wrong classifier. We were training the classifier on white or black, when the right classifier was, is a square occupied by the person to move or the opponent, right? Split thing. And so so neural network people will tell you to convert from a flip thing to not flip thing is an XOR function, and XOR is the thing that you can't implement in a single layer neural network, so you need a second layer to do it. So the whole reason you need a second layer is to implement this XOR function so that you can convert from one to the other. It's like a total waste. Anyway, so Hewitt says, don't use MLPs. MLPs have this overfitting problem. Oh, we have a lot of those questions to get to. Maybe I'll talk about it next time. But the way to read the Hewitt paper is that this is his bottom line. The green line is linear probes. And Hewitt is saying, what you really want is you want things that are selective, that they're surprisingly good. You want something that's surprisingly good. You don't want something that was really hard to extract the information out of. And here, this green line is always surprisingly good. It's like floating above these other classifiers that you had to train so hard to get something out of. And so Hewitt's takeaway is that accuracy is not the point of a probe. You're not trying to get the most accuracy, right? Like it's the surprise. It's like how much unexpected accuracy you have. Like better than some baseline. Okay, so Hewitt suggests some baseline, and he says the gap between those accuracies is what is conic selectivity. So it's an important point to get. I can talk about it a little more next time. But yeah, that's the story of probes. So yeah, so I finished. Last week I was telling you the story. It was just sort of my personal lesson of how to do probing wrong. And so the basic idea of probing was that once you have a probe that can tell the difference between A and B, between one platform and the opposite, then you can use the accuracy of the probe to kind of guide you as an estimate for how much your representation knows the concept, right? So we did that here for Othello, but there were two different types of classifiers that we could train. One is that we trained linear classifiers, but the linear classifiers were, and we trained multi-layer spectron classifiers, like 2-layer, and they work right like 98% of the time. And so we thought, well, if you can train any classifier on the thing, then that'll simply show the information is in there. Right. So we published it, and then I sort of told you the story that Yolanda came out a few weeks later and said, no, this MLP, you don't need to do it. You can get the information out with a linear classifier. And so this is, I really like this chart. So this is the chart where it says, here's like, white, which is a really bad guess, is like 25% wrong. And the classifier 25% wrong. And then black or really dark blue here is like 0% wrong. And so our MLPs were 0% wrong, but he trained this linear classifier to do it. He trained the same linear classifier that we put in the GitHub. And it was bad. It was like 25% wrong most of the time. But then when he switched it so that the classifier predicted the things not on every turn, but on every other turn, it'd be like, instead of looking at the representation on every word, look at every other word, or instead of every sentence, looking at every other sentence. Or if you're studying dialogue between two people, like, don't look at every sentence, but every other sentence, right? we got the accuracy up to 99%. And so what the heck? The reason was because what was being represented inside the model was not it had a representation of the off-balance board, but it was encoded in a way that we didn't expect. Instead of encoding a white square is a white pebble is on this square and a black pebble is on another square. It was encoding a different concept, which was not the concept that we had anticipated with our training set. It was encoding, is the pebble on this square owned by the person to move or the opponent, which flips every other time. And so I think that there's a couple lessons from this. So one lesson is look at your data. So this is like one of the reasons that before I went into causal mediation analysis and all these other things, I was like, hey, let's just make some scatter plots to just look at some vectors and just get into the practice of doing that. I think that there's probably other ways of looking at the data too, but that's the most obvious thing to try. But if you have a way of just like looking at the raw data somehow, so Neil has like a bunch of different visualizations he was doing to try to look at the raw data, and just live with that for a while, like get a little sense for it. You might find out that you're asking the wrong question of your model, that you have your own human bias or how you think the model might represent something, but the model might represent something in a slightly different way. That would change what you find a lot. And so I thought this was really interesting because it's a clear case where the model had an equivalent concept, but one that the classifier definition of the concept that we had was totally wrong, so wrong that it gave us this really bad accuracy. And so, but there's a second takeaway besides that, which is that we were able to get the accuracy up to 98% with an MLP, which leads to this question: like, were we fooling ourselves somehow? Like, what's wrong with an MLP, right? And that's what the Hewitt paper is basically about. And so I just wanted to go over this, and the basic idea of the Hewitt paper is, yes.
Before we get into this paper, did he mention anything about his intuition for why did he look into my versus your table?
I think this was the first figure where he showed it. And I think that, he was visualizing the data in different direct ways. I don't know exactly which visualization he used. Like in the end, he had a lot of these kind of color diagrams of what the predictions were and how accurate they were. And so he was doing like this. You might think of this as sort of a logit lens kind of visualization or something, Othello board. And so I think he was just building a lot of these sort of logit lens style visualizations. And then I don't know what gave him the idea that maybe the classifier could have been made better by making the problem easier. So this is always the pattern in research, right? In research, you have something, you're trying to make it work. And you really believe in your hypothesis. You got to chase your hypothesis for a while. You think that there's got to be something here, but everything that we do to measure it is like coming up noise. And then the right reaction to that, until you stop believing your hypothesis, right? The right reaction is, is there a different way for me to set up the experiment? Maybe I have some confounder in there. Maybe I've got something that's making it unnecessarily hard. Maybe I've got something in there that's all noise that isn't a necessary part of the experiment that I can remove. And so I think that's what this experiment here is. It's like O'Neill says, well, maybe, for whatever reason, maybe doing this classifier in every single turn is somehow confounder, right? Maybe it'd be easier if we pick the easy turns to do. What would the easy turns be? Well, maybe the easy turns would be all the turns where the same person is moving or something, every other turn, right? And, you can see how that would be like an easier problem, right? You only have to classify half of the things. And so I often will recommend this when people are doing different pieces of things, it's like, oh, your results are really noisy. Maybe some sort of subset analysis would be useful. Maybe you don't have to, get your result to be clean on the whole data. Maybe on a subset, maybe on half the data. Maybe there's a certain third of the data where your result is really clean. What is that one third? If it's systematic, then you still learn something, right? And that's basically what Neil did here. He says, okay, let's do it on half the data, and boom, it worked. I was not a very experienced advisor when I was working with Kenneth on this problem. Otherwise, I'm very embarrassed that we didn't do it. All I did was tell Kenneth really should be a linear classifier, right? And he tried really hard, but we didn't do something like do a subset analysis. Okay, so the second lesson though that comes out of it is MLPs can kind of fool you, and that's what the John Hewitt paper is about. And so I just give you a little bit of overview of what's going on here. And so the idea here is that, so this diagram here is the diagram of actually I don't really even know how to understand it's this diagram, but it's a diagram of what a control task might be for part of speech tagging. And the basic idea is that normally to do part of speech tagging, you have to do a lot of interesting things. You might have to disambiguate ambiguous words, like I was telling you, play can sometimes be a noun, sometimes it can be a verb, it can sometimes be transitive, it can sometimes not be transitive, and whatever, right? And so to figure out what kind of verb it is or what kind of noun it is, you sort of have to understand what's going on in the sentence. And so part of speech tagging is kind of tricky. You gotta do this thing. And so what John says is instead, what he's going to do, so he says, so if you train a classifier to classify part of speech tags out of one of these networks, you find that it has a certain accuracy. It can get the part of speech tags out with a linear classifier at maybe 85% or something like that, which is okay. And then he says, but he's frustrated because a lot of people publish papers saying, oh, I can do better than the last person who wrote a probe paper saying that I can get this out at 85%. I have a new paper and I can get it out at 99%. And I've done it using a multi-layer perceptron probe, like a fancier probe, like a more complicated machine learning thing. And so now I've really proved that the information's there. It's like 99%. And John's point is that that's not really the point of it. We had a math class in here just a few minutes ago, and I feel like it's kind of like asking people, "Can you solve this math problem?" And you give them a pencil, and then it gives you a measure of whether they can solve the math problem, and they say, "Yeah, they're learning something from the class. Like 80% of the people can solve the math problem. My probe has succeeded in telling me how much they know math." And then somebody else says, "Well, I'll really tell you whether they know math." And they distribute pocket calculators to everybody. And they say, with pocket calculators, can you solve this math problem? And it's 100%, everybody can solve it. It's so now does that give you a better sense that everybody knows what's going on in the math? I'm not sure it does, right? And so I think that this is more or less what, John Hewitt's point of view is on the difference between a linear probe and an MLP. And the way that, he proved it was to come up with a control task baseline suggestion. And so what he says is that what MLPs are good at is they're really good at learning how to solve new problems that your neural network didn't already know how to solve. Right? Does that make sense? It's the analogy would be not giving calculators to everybody in class. What if you gave everybody ChatGPT in class and then you gave them the test, right? ChatGPT is not only good at solving the math problem, it's good at solving new problems that you haven't seen before. And so even if you come up with a really creative test with all sorts of new things that are getting the students to think if they're using ChatGPT, it's sort of that test instrument that you're using might hide the signal. And so the idea here is that the control task is the new task. So you've got a task that is your regular hypothesis, like part of speech tagging, and a control task is something that would be hard to learn, but that would be kind of meaningless. And so the thing that he did here is random tagging. So he went to every single word and he gave it a random tag instead of part of speech tag. Like, so what is this? It's like cat is normally a noun, but instead cat is part of speech 37 or something like that. I don't know. Like he could have shuffled it and said, oh, part of speech is a verb or something like that, right? And then dog is normally a noun, but like dog now is like part of speech 15 or something like. So cat and dog are like in different classes, just totally messes it all up, right? And so if you want to solve the control task, you'd have to sort of memorize this nonsense garbage and figure it out, right? That makes sense? And so the idea is if you give this special AI to the system and you ask it, can you use this AI together with your own brain to solve the part of speech task? And can you use the AI together with your own brain to solve the control task? And it gets like 100% on both of them, then that's sort of an indication that the AI is doing all the work. Because we don't think that your own brain is actually doing the control task. Does that make sense? We don't think that your own brain actually represents cat totally different from dog. Like we think that like it thinks both of them are nouns, kind of similar nouns. That makes sense? But the control task has some other garbage thing, which we don't think is in your head. And then so if we give you a probing tool that measures 100% on that, it's probably not measuring what's in your head. Make sense? So that's the basic idea of the Hewitt thing. And so here's the regular probe. And then here's the control task probe. And here's what happens when you have this MLP and you make the MLP really weak. So you make it so it's barely extra layer, right? You make the extra layer like not too many neurons, right? And then here's where you make it really fat extra layer, right? You've got like a lot of extra neurons in this extra layer, right? And when the MLP has a lot of extra neurons in layer, you can see that it can take this garbage task and get it to near 100%, which is meaning that the MLP is learning the new thing by itself. It's not that it was already there in the brain that you're testing. Make sense? You get it? But here, when the MLP is really weak, you can get really high. Any questions about this? Shuyi, is Shuyi here? Yes.
Yeah, the adjusting is very strong, like the rise. Then we will say that it's not a blue probe, then it's not there.
That's right. So you would say, if it was here, you would say you're at 99%, but like for the red one, you'd say it's 99%, but it's not a very good probe. And so actually the logic is actually what John would say is it's this blue one, which is at 99%, which is not a good probe. So even though the blue one is measuring the thing that we really believe is in there, John would say, don't believe this blue one because the gap to the red thing is tiny. The selectivity is low. So even though the accuracy is 99%, the selectivity is 1 or 2%. So do you think that that's fair? Or do you think it's unfair?
I just think there, because that means if the probe is very strong, then you always think it's not a blue probe.
You think if the probe is very strong,
Yeah.
then
You will always think it's not a blue probe. Because we must select.
well, no, like this probe, let's say this blue point was up here. let's just say it was up there. You wouldn't say it was bad. You'd say it was good because the gap between it and the red thing is pretty large. Yes, no? That makes sense. What do you think that?
Yeah, I think one way to describe it is like just because you give somebody ChatGPT and they can solve the thing doesn't mean they don't know how to solve it without chat. Like it could be.
Oh, maybe it's unfair.
It could very
maybe
much
it's
be
unfair.
the case that they still know how to
I see.
solve it.
I
But I
see.
think the question, I think
I see.
but that what John is saying
I
is like,
see.
how big of an update is it?
That's right.
Even though
So
like,
we can't fail you.
we can't fail you, but we can't say that you've learned it.
That's right. That's right. That makes sense. So if we like if you get like 100% on the test, and you by using ChatGPT, and then you can also get like 99% on a garbage test using ChatGPT, can we fail you? And the answer you're saying is no. That's not fair. We can't fail you, right? But what we can say is it's not a very good test.
It's not a don't have to do much.
Does that make sense? That's right. Yeah, but it's not enough to fail you. It's not enough to say that you're dumb. Right? Okay, maybe that answers your question. Okay, but it does mean. So what I'd say is selectivity fair? It's fair against the test is what it is. So we're backing up one level. We're not asking how good the model is. We're asking how good the test is. Right? And it's a good way of saying it's a bad test. Yeah. I'll say okay. So Guangyan had a comment. I'm not here. No, not even online. That's it pipe up. But that's
Hello,
okay.
can you hear me?
Yes. What was your question?
Yeah, I was asking like why do they argue regulation to reduce generalization gap is not sufficient if your goal is selectivity?
Right. So, is regularization enough? I think that in a sense, this plot is one of an example where it says, well, regularization is not nothing. So one form of regularization is to just reduce the parameterization, right? And you can see that it improves selectivity. Here's more different types of regularization here. So here, they're doing weight decay, right? And some other things. And I guess what they're so I'd say that the conclusion from here is that regularization does help somewhat, right? When you regularize more, when you do this is sample count, reducing the sample early stopping, you reduce the rank, reduce the number of parameters, you have higher dropout, you have higher weight decay, so all the higher regularization things are on the left. You can see selectivity generally rises when you go to the left. So the paper isn't, if you look at, I don't know about the words of the paper, but if you look at the actual results, the paper isn't totally down on regularization. It's like, okay. But then there's this other trend that he notices that's even stronger than regularization, which is the difference between the green lines and the red and the blue lines. Does that make sense? And so the green lines here are all the linear models, and the red and the blue lines are all the MLPs, like the nonlinear models. And for the same amount of weight decay or dropout or early stopping or whatever, the green lines are pretty consistently like a pretty big gap in selectivity over the red and the blue models. And so that's why John Hewitt is like, I'm not going to recommend that people use regularization. I just recommend people use linear models, like a simpler solution, right? You get better selectivity. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure. And so now, so I think this is a little bit of the background why I kept on harping on our student kind of to try to do a linear model, because of this kind of thing. Now, some people will still probe with nonlinear models because it does tell you something, but you have to watch out for this type of issue. Selectivity is related to overfitting and it's a classic machine learning problem to be aware of. So, and selectivity is, and designing a randomized control task. If you have a complicated probe, even if you have a very high dimensional linear probe, when you write your papers, if you want to get them through peer review, this is not a bad way of convincing a reviewer that your probe is a good test, right? Come up with a random control task. Say, John Hewitt, say we're going to like show the gap. We're going to measure the selectivity against this thing. You might have to put the chart in the appendix for room. But if you can show a gap like this, then you'll convince a reviewer it's actually a good probe that you have. Even if it's not linear, even if it's MLP, you could defend it this way.
If the idea is that like performance is only meaningful if it like disappears when like the meaningful structure is like destroyed, how do you like what kind of intuition do you use to identify that like meaningful structure like that we need to control out?
Oh, like what a good control task is?
Yeah.
Yeah, you asked that question.
What
Yeah.
good control?
What a good control task is.
Yeah, because I feel like the control task that they're like control tasks are a function of word identity.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of like
Just give every word a random part of speech.
yes, and I think that like that seems to tell you like how well can you compute random lookup tables as a function. Like I feel like how hard it is to compute a random lookup table depends on how hard it is to derive word identity or how hard it is to determine the function that you're interested in. And so I don't really know if there's an obvious
because when you saw his, so he had another control task for I don't know if I have the thing like part of speech tagging, but then also like dependency relationships in that, so which he said, oh, we'll have a weird control task which is we'll randomly send an arc to the left or to the right in the middle or something like that, right? So and then you look at that and you think, I don't know if I would have invented that control task. Right. It's just like some random thing, right? So like a random part of speech for every word. Yeah, sure. That like maybe, like So there's a classic experiment that machine learning people like to do, which is they like to say, how powerful is my network, my neural network, by taking a regular classification set and shuffling all the labels. So you have like, a million images and some of them are dogs and some of them are cats and some of them are sailboats and some of them are trucks and whatever, right? And then what you do is you just take exactly the same data set and you just completely scramble all the labels and then you train your model on it to see what accuracy you get on that. It's exactly the same as this experiment here, but it's like but what they call that is they call that the memorization baseline. Right, so there's these two things that you can have a model do. Machine learning people like to say that you can have a model generalize or memorize. And so when a model generalizes, it's supposed to be finding regular patterns in the data. And after it sees a few of the same regular patterns, then even if you show it a new example of a new sailboat that it's never seen before, a new cat that it's never seen before, because it recognized the patterns for a sailboat or a cat, right? It can guess the new one, right? But the other thing that network can do is just memorize. It can remember that I saw exactly this cat before, and this cat is A, and I saw this other cat, and this other cat is class B, and this sailboat here is class A, and this a different sailboat is like class B, and it's just like they're just all scrambled. Some sailboats are A, and some sailboats are B, and some cats are A, and some cats are B, and they don't look anything like each other. But if you have a powerful neural network, it can remember that anyway after you train it for a while, but it won't do what we call generalization. If you show it a new cat, then it will have no idea. It'll give it a random label because it has no idea what random means. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that a classic control task is just shuffle the labels. So like if you needed to come up with a control task, then the natural thing to do would be to just say, well, just like Hewitt, we're going to shuffle the labels. We have stripy things and not stripy things, and we'll have a control task, and we'll just like randomly assign stripy things to not stripy or something like that. and we'll see how well our probe does that. But here it's like, well, sometimes that's too hard, and like if you really shuffle every single thing, it might be too hard. So you might want to arrange things in groups and then shuffle the groups or something like that to make it a little easier. And the reason is because he's looking for this gap. And if you make the control task too hard, then the control task can sit down there at low accuracy, even though he's arguing that what you want to do is you want to find that there's a meaningless task that it could have learned instead. So so this is it's a kind of a hole in his analysis. That you need to come up with a good control task that reveals the weakness of your test. Right? Make sense? Yeah. It's like I think that after spring break, I'm supposed to have a professor come here and watch me teach, and so they're gonna see if there's a hole in the way that I teach, something that I'm doing that doesn't convey to you guys the actual knowledge, but just makes you feel like you have the illusion of getting knowledge or something like that. And so, but what's the test, right? Well, you could devise a test and passes it with flying colors, but maybe with a more stringent test, you could say, oh, there's a gap here, there's a selectivity problem, and but there's an art to coming up with. So then the last thing I wanted to talk about probing was other things that you can do for probing. There were a bunch of questions from Ayush and Eunice about probing ideology and personality and biases, things like this. And so I just want to point out that there's been a bunch of work doing probing for interesting things. There's this nice work from Yuta Chen over at Harvard that builds probes that look into LLMs that tell you like, does the LLM think that you are a certain age, a certain gender, a certain socioeconomic status, certain education. And what these classifiers are is they're basically probes. I think they just trained a bunch of linear probes on a bunch of text that came from young people, that came from men and women, that came from whatever, right? And they said, how accurate is the model at, classifying this information? And they took their high accuracy probes and they hooked them up to a user interface. So you can probe for things like beauty, you can probe for things like socioeconomic status, and and it often works pretty well. Okay, that's all I wanted to talk about for probes.